Welcome to Scaffold's podcast, a weekly roundup of the timely updates on insect and disease management, as well as phenological developments across New York State for apple growers. This is Monique Rivera, your host and assistant professor of entomology at Cornell AgriTech. Co-hosting with me today will be Dr. Kerik Cox, associate professor of plant pathology, and Dr. Anna Wallis, fruit IPM coordinator. In this episode, I discuss timing for woolly apple aphid treatments and more on leaf rollers. Kerik Cox talks about the biology and symptoms of apple blotch, and Anna Wallis gives the state-of-the-state update on our continued degree day accumulation and ramp up for the second round of seasonal pests. Happy week of 4th of July! This is my first week for a while not doing an interview, but today I'm going to talk about a couple points of clarification. So first, treatment timing for woolly apple aphids, and then second, we'll talk more about leaf rollers. So when it comes to timing for woolly apple aphid sprays, I just want to give you the bad news that if you've been waiting to spray an infestation and the infestation is growing, you're probably not going to solve the problem with the softer insecticides. So what's happening under the wool right now is population turnover. So even if you can get access to the top layer of insects underneath that wool, it doesn't really matter because underneath them are basically babies. So small nymphal larvae underneath of them. And so this is why it's important to target these with those systemic insecticides like Movento, or at least translaminar effective ones. However, I can really tell you that these aren't going to work because this is a big part of what I did last week. We were running a trial to compare some of the different insecticides for woolly apple aphid. And being the scientist that I am, I was like, let's wait for these colonies to show up so we know that they're there. So we are going to apply this treatment and we're going to try to correct that. But when we actually removed the colonies from the tree after treatment, what we found is that after 3 days, we were basically no longer seeing mortality. Essentially, what I'm saying here is that if you've waited too long and you see a bunch of wool, diazinon is what is going to work. A grower that I'm collaborating with is putting on the diazinon to spray out the trial this week, and I'm going to go back and collect some colonies and look at that efficacy for comparison. So I do think this is going to be a challenging pest to work with. And as much as I don't love recommending prophylactic spraying, if you have a block where you have a history of woolies, put that Movento on before June 15th, before you see the woolies in the block forming on the trees. And the key here is getting the treatment into the plant before you have that significant wool blow up, because the blow up of the wool is essentially caused by the insect actively feeding. So when they're feeding, that's when they're putting out that white substance that we also refer to as honeydew or wool in this case. And so that's another reason why I think the next front here is really chemigation. But let's see if I can convince my collaborators to install this or get it up and running at AgriTech. I doubt this will happen quickly, either for the growers or for us, because it's going to take us at AgriTech a couple years to get the plants established. And then, making sure that if I were to work with a collaborator, that the chemigation is installed properly so that we can actually compare treatments. This could be challenging. So for now, I'm hoping to update the recommendations this year to make sure that I am very clear in the guidelines that those softer insecticides are to be used in blocks where you're going to have them, you have a history of them, and do it early. So to move on to our next section here of talking about leaf rollers, I wanted to first direct your attention to the leaf curling midge webinar that Mike Bastow recently hosted. I've heard that a small bit of apple leaf curling midge is around Western New York, but I hear more on average about this pest from those in the North Country. I also want to clarify that just because we're not seeing oblique-banded leaf roller in New York, that does not mean that it can't pop back up and rear its ugly head in Western New York. For leaf curling midge, this used to be thought of as a pest that affected younger trees or a nursery issue, but these can explode apparently in high-density plantings. And the impact lies in the reduction in the photosynthetic abilities and winter hardiness to the tree. So that's how these pests can potentially impact trees. There also can be a stunting of growth to young trees. So according to Christy Grigg McGuffin from the webinar, which will be linked in the show notes, this is a significant pest in Ontario, Canada. that's not so far away from us. Also, as an entomologist, it was a bit mind-blowing to hear that these are actually gall-forming midges, and the leaf curling is not due to the feeding of the insect. So basically what it sounds like is that when they do feed, in their salivary processing with the plant, they are releasing some sort of chemical that's causing the leaf to curl up. So typically the newly hatched larvae are feeding and exposing the plant to that chemical, which is causing the leaf to curl. But then after they have gone through their different larval stages, they drop down from the leaf and finish pupating in the soil. So anytime there's something pupating in the soil, this is an opportunity for the insect to die by predation, infection, or infestation of the larvae or the pupae. So this might be something to look into, but I haven't seen good success with entomopathogenic nematodes used for larvae and pupae that are so small. But it could be promising. In my lab, we're starting to think about combining entomopathogenic nematodes and entomopathogenic fungi to see if we can get an increased efficacy. That's all for this week. Maybe next week I'll be back with another interview.
Hello, it's Kerik coming at you from Cornell AgriTech with some plant pathology updates post-Independence Day. So what do we have going on this week? Last week, I got a couple of questions about Marssonina blotch, Marssonina leaf blotch specifically. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about that disease. I mentioned it a couple of other episodes on the podcast. I'm just going to do another little brief sort of description and talk a little bit about what the disease is like, what its life cycle is like, and then next week we're going to crack down into the management. I've mentioned some things to do to manage it already briefly in some of the other episodes that just happened a few weeks ago. So what is Marssonina leaf blotch? Sadly, it has had a new name. It is now called apple blotch. Same disease, now by the sexual state of the pathogen, diplocarpin. Previously, it was named after the asexual reproductive state. Now it's named after the sexual stage. This is what mycologists like to do. You need a new paper, change name, do some more phylogenetics, and confuse the growers for the next 5 years. Don't worry, I will be here talking about both diseases anytime I give an extension talk. So Marssonina leaf blotch is now known as apple blotch, and it's caused by diplocarpin, making it a lot harder to call it Marssonina leaf blotch. Anyway, so what is this disease going to do? What it's going to do is it's going to defoliate your tree early. And usually some of the defoliation that we'll start to notice will happen mid to late August, and that's a little earlier than you want the leaves falling off the tree. They'll start to lose leaves probably around the end of July at a very slow rate. It'll happen from the insides of the tree. This is what you'll begin to see. What will happen? It'll first look like, oh no, do I have a little bit of captan injury? It'll be sort of a reddish maroon color. And this would have been the value of being able to do a live Twitch stream for this sort of thing. I'd just show you the pictures of what this looks like. It'll start out kind of a maroon, and the leaf area around it looked like someone sort of just misted captan and under slow drying conditions, and it kind of burnt it. It looks sort of maroon and off color. Then what will happen is the chlorophyll in these sections will die, and it'll look really splotchy with yellow mixed with the darker maroon colors. At this time, various spores are being produced inside it. And right before the leaf will fall off, you'll see that in a cluster, all the other leaves are normal except for the ones that are affected, and they might look quite clean and healthy. But that's just the beginning of a big problem. And if you could get down in there, it's going to look splotchy. If you think about it in terms of animals, think about this disease looking like a Dalmatian versus a giraffe, which has very defined margins to its spot, and this is sort of a diffuse Dalmatian spotty kind of dog thing. And if you get down in the darkened areas in the very center, it'll be like a center of brown area, highlighted in an island of green, and in a field of yellow chlorosis. You'll be able to see these little tiny black specks, little fruiting bodies. Also, what will end up happening is these will lead to little lenticel infections, which could look like captan injury, could look like Botrosphaeria infections of lenticels, could even look like a little tiny splotch of herbicide, depending on what the problem is. But this is all the diplocarpin and apple blotch type symptoms. How this is going to happen? It's just going to be just like apple scab. The leaves are going to defoliate, they're going to fall to the ground, they're going to overwinter, they're going to mature just like apple scab, they're going to make their sexual structure. In this case, it kind of looks like an apothecia, if you will, like a little cup with ascospores in it. Oh my goodness, we're still talking about ascospores? That's right. These are going to eject when the rains come. Usually it's going to be sort of late bloom, petal fall. Really likes that 66 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. It'll be starting to happen there, and then that's when the infections of the leaves will begin to mature. They might happen early on, just like with apple scab, but they're going to begin to mature, and they're going to have this sort of Dalmatian splotchy pattern, and they're going to fall onto the ground, and they're going to start the whole cycle over again. Now, you might be asked, well, how does this look different from glomerella leaf spot? Glomerella leaf spot's a more southern disease. It's going to be more like your giraffe in terms of its spots. They're going to be large. They're going to be almost kind of angular and a little bit more concentric. It won't be an irregular brownish magenta-looking mass with little black dots in it, surrounded by a green island, surrounded by a yellow island. It'll be more delineated, more sharply defined looking spot. And when we get to the winter meetings next year, I'll show you some pictures of these. So next week's episode, I'm going to actually talk about what to do about management. It's going to begin with sanitation, and it's going to begin with when to start your fungicide programs. Which fungicides seem to be the best according to those places in the South? Welcome to the world of what it must be like to be a North Carolina apple grower in the 90s. We're starting to see things we've never seen before, and we may have to keep our fungicide programs going longer and into the summer with some of our single-site fungicides. All right, that's all I've got for this week. I'll talk to you later.
And now for the state of the state, your weekly roundup of degree day accumulations and phenology from the major fruit production regions of the state. As always, this information has been aggregated from the regional specialists around the state, NEWA, and my own observations. Fruit is continuing to size and color nicely throughout the state. Moving into July, we should have seen the effect of thinners by this point and natural June drop. Now is a good time to be taking tissue samples for leaf tissue analysis for nutrient management. We've continued to get lots of rain over the past couple of weeks. This past weekend, an inch or two were recorded at most NEWA locations across the state, although some places only recorded about a quarter of an inch, with high winds reported in many places in northeastern New York. So it seems we've received very heavy rain events, but very specific to location. Last week, we also had very heavy rain, an inch or two in many locations. Over 3 was recorded in Geneva. Unfortunately, some of those storms also included reports of hail in western New York. A reminder, a good place to search for severe weather updates, including hail and heavy wind reports, are on the NOAA Storm Prediction Center, which I've linked again in the show notes. According to the Northeast Regional Climate Center, for the month of June, most of the Northeast continues to be very dry with locally heavy rain. In New York, most production regions received less than the average precipitation, but close to average. Temperatures were near average or a touch cooler, which is a little bit hard to believe right now given the heat wave that's happening across the country. You can see more information about that on the Northeast Regional Climate Center website, which is also linked in the show notes. For the month of July, however, the outlook is predicted to be warmer and wetter than average. And that's also information that we'll link in the show notes. It's available on the NOAA Climate Prediction Center website. We're continuing to track degree day base 43 as an indicator of insect and pest activity. Both degree day base 43 and 50 have been used in the past and are summarized in the table in the show notes. You can also find this information about accumulations related to phenology and arthropod pest activity in the Cornell Tree Fruit Guidelines, Table 714. As we always remind you, degree days since January 1st isn't the best predictor of all apple pests, so we encourage you to use the models in NEWA that correspond to each pest. A few things that are active now include apple maggot, which typically becomes active at the beginning of July. If you haven't already, now is the best time to be hanging red sticky sphere traps for monitoring. Typically, overwintering pupa emerge in the latter half or the end of June. They move from wet, really dense hedgerows into the orchard, so place your traps near these locations or where you've seen damage in the past. Put 3 at each site, and then if an average of 5 flies are captured per trap, that's the action threshold for making a management spray. Codling moth in western New York began its second generation on June 26th, so cover sprays are probably going on at the end of this week. Oblique-banded leaf roller first generation is now active in northeastern New York and western New York. For blocks with a history of this pest, an application targeting larvae should be timed at about 350 degree days, base 43, after the first sustained trap catch, and then again in about 2 weeks. OFM is beginning second generation flight in most of the state. Mites are present now in many orchards. Use the sampling procedure in the Cornell Guidelines, Figure 714. Sample 20 leaves, and now the threshold will be 5 mites per leaf. It increases a little bit in July compared to June. Rosy and green apple aphids continue to be active throughout the state. Woolly apple aphid has continued to be reported in many locations throughout the state, starting typically on pruning cuts and inside the canopy or lower in the canopy, and then moving to young tender shoots. San Jose scale is now active in most of the state. It has been for the past couple of weeks in the Hudson Valley and now in western New York. You can be monitoring for these again by placing black or double-sided sticky tape around branches just above active infestation so you can know when those crawlers are beginning to be active. As Monique discussed, apple leaf curling midge has continued to pop up in some locations across the state. It's an emerging problem in some regions, so we encourage you to watch that webinar. In terms of diseases, we continue to see fire blight infections in places that had outbreaks last year, so keep an eye out, and also keep an eye out for scab infections where it may have slipped through. We're seeing continued lesions in unmanaged or other trouble spots. We're entering the infection periods for summer rots, so pay attention to those as well. Mildew has again been less problematic this week with all of the wet weather that we've had. And finally, here's the rundown of Degree Day Base 43 accumulations from NEWA weather stations throughout the state. As of the end of the day on July 5th, accumulations were in Geneva, 1,589, in Highland at the Hudson Valley Lab, 1,866, in Clifton Park, 1,681, in Peru, 1,489, in Medina, an inland site in western New York, 1,504, Appleton North, a lake site, 1,415, Fairville, an inland site at the Apple Shed, 1,508, and Williamson Deamery, a lake site, 1,473.
And that concludes this week's updates. We hope you enjoy this format of communication, and we hope that you'll provide us feedback on the format over time. Thanks for listening.